In just 17 minutes, a 37-year-old African president stood alone in an American courtroom and dared to challenge the most feared judge on television. Accused of arrogance and disrespect, he exposed secrets from her past that left millions stunned and turned her courtroom upside down. Racism, power, truth. Millions watched, but only a few understood what really happened behind those cameras. Did Judge Whittaker finally meet the one man she couldn't silence, or did he cross a line that could cost him everything? And why did this showdown spark a worldwide debate about race, respect, and the real meaning of authority? To better understand this story, we have to go back to where it all began. For 25 years, Judge Eleanor Whittaker reigned supreme behind her towering mahogany bench, a gleaming gavel never far from her perfectly manicured fingers. She was television's ultimate enforcer, famous not for gentle justice but for the razor-sharp tongue that sliced through excuses and left grown adults trembling. Clips flashed across the screen in rapid succession, a man stumbling over his words as Whittaker barked, "You think that's an answer? Sit down." An older woman recoiling as the judge spat, "Don't roll your eyes at me unless you want to lose them." And a middle-aged man sweating through his suit as she hissed, "I've met smarter goldfish." Each moment drew gales of laughter from live studio audiences who came for one reason, to watch America's queen of courtroom humiliation crush yet another unsuspecting soul under the weight of her scorn. As Eleanor Whittaker strode into court this morning, the heels of her black patent pumps clicked like gunshots on marble, and her lips curled into a smirk that had sent shivers down thousands of spines. Cameramen scrambled to keep up, catching the sparkle of diamond earrings and the glint of that trademark glare as she surveyed the room like a lioness hunting for the weakest gazelle. Yet even as the audience chuckled and clapped, there was an electricity crackling in the air that no one could quite name. The sense that something in this courtroom temple of mockery was about to shift. Whittaker took her place, folding her arms with theatrical precision, and leaned forward on her bench, prepared to deliver another performance that would be replayed for weeks on talk shows and viral clips. But today, the stage was destined to belong to someone else. The side doors of the courtroom swung open with a hushed creak, and a man stepped through. A figure who did not shuffle nervously like so many before him, but walked with the quiet authority of someone who had faced threats far deadlier than a TV judge's scorn. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, stood tall in a crisp charcoal suit that contrasted sharply with his dark skin. His gaze steady, his chin lifted as if the entire nation he led was watching him take every step. The audience fell into a stunned hush, laughter evaporating as whispers rustled like dry leaves through the rows of seats. Some blinked as if struggling to comprehend how a world leader had suddenly appeared on a television set usually reserved for petty squabbles about stolen lawnmowers and security deposits. Whittaker's eyes, moments before glittering with anticipation, flickered with confusion and something else, a fleeting hint of doubt. Her smirk wavered as Ibrahim paused at the defendant's table, nodded politely to the bailiff, and settled into his chair without a trace of fear. The camera zoomed in on the fine gold lapel pin of Burkina Faso's flag gleaming against his suit, a silent emblem of sovereign power in a room built for spectacle. Whittaker straightened, trying to regain her edge, but even the audience sensed the tremor beneath her rigid posture. Here was a man who'd survived political conspiracies, stood firm amid the turmoil of West African coups, and fought to pull his country from the grip of chaos, now sitting mere feet away from a woman whose domain was built on insults and applause. The room seemed to shrink around them as the tension twisted tighter, every breath held in suspense. A single thought pulsed in the silence. Was Judge Whittaker about to deliver her most legendary takedown yet, or was she about to face the first challenger who would not bend, break, or bow? Judge Eleanor Whittaker adjusted the sleeves of her black robe as if preparing for battle, her eyes narrowing with predatory focus as she fixed them on Ibrahim Traoré. Her lips curled into that familiar grin audiences had come to adore, the grin that promised humiliation delivered like a slap across the face. She leaned forward, voice dripping with condescension, and said, "Well, Mr. Traoré, I've seen your speeches on television. Very stirring, very dramatic. But let me tell you how things work here in my courtroom. We don't run governments with fiery speeches and revolutionary slogans. We run things with facts, law, and respect for authority. Something you and your foreign ideals might want to learn before you start lecturing Americans about how to do our jobs." A ripple of laughter rose from the audience, partly nervous, partly entertained, as people exchanged sideways glances, savoring the delicious possibility of watching the mighty president brought low by America's sharpest tongue. Whittaker basked in the moment, lifting her chin a fraction higher as the applause and snickers washed over her like warm applause on a theater stage. Cameramen zoomed in to capture her triumphant smirk, ready to bottle this confrontation for viral clips and primetime specials. She was in her element, an American institution of intimidation towering above a guest who, to her mind, was hopelessly out of his depth. But Ibrahim did not look away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering a chess move, then offered her a faint smile that carried the quiet certainty of a man who'd stared down armed generals and political assassins and survived. He rose slowly to his feet, his suit jacket falling perfectly into place, and clasped his hands in front of him with a courtly elegance that seemed to belong to another century. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but carried the weight of iron beneath silk. "Your Honor," he began, each syllable deliberate and precise, "I thank you for your hospitality and allowing me to appear here today. I respect this institution and the law it represents. But I must also tell you this, I did not come all this way to stay silent while truths remain hidden. I intend to speak, and I intend to speak the truth." A murmur swept through the courtroom like a sudden gust of wind, ruffling papers and spines alike. Judge Whittaker's eyes narrowed into slits, her jaw stiffening as if she'd tasted something bitter. The grin drained from her lips, replaced by a look of pure challenge, as if she were sizing him up for the first time not as an entertainer's prop but as a genuine opponent. And in that charged silence, the laughter that had been bubbling through the courtroom moments before dissolved into an uneasy hush. The audience, suddenly aware that they were no longer watching just another episode of courtroom theatrics. They were witnessing the beginning of a collision between two worlds, one built on performance, the other forged in the fires of real power and real consequences. The silence that had swallowed the courtroom hung so heavily that it seemed almost to bend the air, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Judge Whittaker, striving to regain the upper hand, snapped her fingers at Ibrahim and declared, "Save your speeches for your parliament, Mr. President. Here we deal in facts, not grandstanding." The audience let out a brittle little laugh, though it was tinged with unease, like people laughing at a joke they weren't quite sure was funny. Whittaker leaned back in her chair, waving a dismissive hand, her voice dripping contempt as she said, "Unless, of course, you've come all this way to show me something more interesting than speeches." Ibrahim, still standing with his hands folded, regarded her with a gaze that seemed to look right through the wooden panels of her bench and into the very marrow of who she was. Slowly, he reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew a slim folder, its edges neat and sharp, the ivory paper within crisp and untouched by television lights. A wave of restless shuffling passed through the audience, punctuated by the faint creaks of seats as people leaned forward, their curiosity ignited by the strange spectacle of a foreign president daring to pull out paperwork in Judge Whittaker's personal arena. Whittaker's eyebrows lifted in exaggerated disbelief as she scoffed, "And what exactly is that supposed to be, Mr. Traoré? Your travel itinerary? A list of grievances against American television?" Her sarcasm earned a scattering of nervous laughter, but this time it was thinner, less certain, as if even the crowd sensed the earth shifting beneath their feet. Ibrahim merely opened the folder with a single precise motion, the paper rustling like dry leaves underfoot, and held up a document with a series of official seals along the margin. In a voice as cool and measured as a surgeon's scalpel he said, "Your Honor, since you've questioned my understanding of law and governance, I thought it prudent to examine yours. This is a record from 1987, Family Court, New York City. In this case, you ruled against a single mother seeking child support, citing that she, and I quote, should have made better personal choices rather than rely on the court system." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room as the audience's eyes shot from Ibrahim to Whittaker and back again, their expressions frozen in wide-eyed disbelief. Whittaker's mouth twitched as if she were about to speak, but no sound came out, her lips parting and closing like those of someone who'd been slapped. Ibrahim calmly flipped to the next page, holding up the papers for the cameras and the judge alike. 3 years later, he continued, the appellate court overturned your ruling, stating that your reasoning displayed insufficient consideration of legal standards and an inappropriate intrusion of personal judgment. An electric silence gripped the courtroom, broken only by the tiny whir of camera lenses zooming in to capture every flicker of Whittaker's paling face. People in the audience stared, mouths agape, as though they'd just witnessed a lion tamer mauled in his own cage. Ibrahim lowered the papers slightly, his dark eyes never leaving Whittaker's. "I did not come here to disrespect this courtroom," he said, voice steady. "But when my qualifications and my integrity are called into question, I believe it's only fair we examine yours as well." For the first time, the indomitable Judge Eleanor Whittaker seemed to shrink in her chair, her aura of invincibility battered by the force of documented truth. And it was suddenly glaringly clear to everyone watching, Ibrahim Traoré was not here to play. Judge Whittaker's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of her bench, eyes glittering with indignation as Ibrahim's words hung in the air like a sword poised to fall. Her voice cracked the silence like a whip as she thundered, "Young man, you will not come into my courtroom and try to embarrass me with old files and political theater. I have been interpreting the law longer than you have been alive, and I will not tolerate disrespect, especially from someone who thinks he can rewrite the rules because he wears a presidential sash." She lifted her chin, her silver hair trembling slightly with the force of her rage, and jabbed a finger in his direction. "This courtroom is built on respect, on decorum, on understanding one's place. That's something your generation, and certainly your foreign governments, seem to have forgotten." A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the courtroom, but they carried none of the confident laughter from earlier, sounding instead like the brittle titter of people who couldn't decide if they should laugh or leave. Whitaker pressed on, her voice rising higher with every syllable, desperate to recapture the audience's allegiance as she proclaimed, "In my court, you don't talk over me. You don't grandstand, and you certainly don't try to lecture me about the Constitution of the United States." She paused, chest heaving slightly, her gavel hovering over the bench as if tempted to come crashing down. But Ibrahim Traoré did not flinch, did not blink, and did not lower his eyes. Instead, he gently placed the folder back into his briefcase and took a slow, deliberate breath that seemed to draw the entire room into a shared moment of anticipation. When he spoke, his voice was steady low, and edged with quiet authority. "Your Honor, I understand respect," he said, each word flowing with practiced precision. "But respect is not silence in the face of power. True respect lies in upholding justice, even when it is uncomfortable. And the foundation of any true democracy, American or African, is the principle of checks and balances." Whitaker stared at him, her eyes narrowing, but said nothing as Ibrahim continued, his tone gathering momentum like a rising tide. "Article 1, Section 1 of your own Constitution grants legislative power to Congress. Article 1, Section 8 empowers Congress to regulate courts, including the Supreme Court. It is not disrespectful for leaders to question judges. It is their constitutional duty. In my country, I uphold that same principle because justice must never become a throne for a single person, no matter how powerful or famous." He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book, lifting it so that the camera captured its embossed title, "The Constitution of the United States of America." "This document," he said, voice calm yet ringing with undeniable strength, "is not a stage prop. It is a promise that no authority, no judge, no president is above scrutiny. And I stand here today not as a man seeking applause or ratings, but as a leader who believes that truth must be spoken, even when it shakes the walls of this courtroom." The audience sat frozen, eyes wide, the silence broken only by the faint mechanical buzz of a camera lens adjusting focus. And in that silence, Judge Eleanor Whitaker, who had spent decades reducing courtroom guests to stammering wrecks, found herself visibly struggling for words, her practiced composure crumbling under the weight of a lesson she never expected to receive on her own stage. For the first time, she was out of her depth. A hush hovered over the courtroom as Ibrahim carefully closed the leather-bound Constitution and slipped it back into his jacket. His movements deliberate and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and nothing left to prove. He stood tall, hands folded in front of him, his gaze fixed calmly on Judge Whitaker, who stared back with a tightness around her eyes that betrayed the cracks in her once impenetrable armor. For a moment, it seemed as though she might strike back with one of her blistering retorts. But before she could summon the words, Ibrahim spoke again, his tone even softer but edged with something sharper than steel. "Your Honor," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness, "I have one more question, not as the president of Burkina Faso, but as a man who respects the truth. Tell me, please, is this truly your courtroom anymore, or is it simply a stage where you play the part of judge for the sake of television ratings?" A ripple shot through the audience like a sudden shiver, drawing sharp intakes of breath and the nervous rustle of shifting bodies. A few people gave startled little laughs, high and brittle, the kind that bubble up when the tension becomes too electric to bear. The bailiff blinked rapidly, as though unsure whether to intervene or remain frozen in place, and camera operators leaned forward as if pulled by invisible strings, lenses trained tightly on Whitaker's face. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out, her lips parting and closing again like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Ibrahim tilted his head slightly, waiting with the serene patience of someone who just asked a question he already knew the answer to. For a woman who had built her legacy on thunderous authority and scathing put-downs, Judge Whitaker suddenly appeared terribly small behind her grand mahogany bench. The robes that once seemed so imposing now looked more like heavy drapery hanging from weary shoulders. The silence thickened, each second stretching longer than the last, until it felt like the entire room was holding its breath, balanced on the knife's edge between revelation and collapse. A single cough from somewhere in the back of the courtroom echoed like a gunshot in a canyon, amplifying the sense of an audience collectively stunned into disbelief. The camera zoomed closer, capturing Whitaker's face in crisp detail, her eyes wide, the fine lines around them etched deeper than ever, the slightest tremor in her lower lip betraying the magnitude of the blow she'd just received. Ibrahim remained unmoving, his posture radiating quiet confidence, his silence as commanding as any speech he could have delivered. The atmosphere, once a circus of laughter and jeers, now simmered with the weight of an uncomfortable truth that no one in the room could ignore. And as the lens framed the judge's pale, silent expression, the voiceover cut through the hush with quiet finality, a president reminding a TV judge he was no longer on the bench. Silence is sometimes the loudest admission. By dawn the next day, the echoes of that 17-minute courtroom showdown were crashing across the globe like thunder rolling through distant hills. From the neon glare of Times Square news tickers to quiet living rooms half a world away, people were glued to their screens, jaws dropping as the footage played on an endless loop. News anchors, perched behind glossy desks under bright studio lights, struggled to keep a straight face as they replayed the now iconic moment. President Ibrahim Traoré standing tall and composed as he gently yet unmistakably questioned whether Judge Eleanor Whitaker's courtroom was a place of real justice or merely a stage for entertainment. One silver-haired anchor on a major American network could barely contain a grin as she turned to her co-host and exclaimed, "I've been covering trials for 30 years, and I have never seen a judge left speechless like that." The audience behind her burst into laughter, while a producer off-camera signaled to keep rolling the clip again and again, milking every second of Whitaker's stunned expression for maximum ratings. Meanwhile, the internet was ablaze in a digital wildfire of memes and hashtags that spread faster than a rumor in a small town. TikTok creators choreographed comedic skits where actors dressed as Whitaker tried and failed to respond to Ibrahim's cool logic, only to slink off the stage in defeat. On Twitter, animated GIFs circulated like precious currency, Whitaker blinking in silence, Whitaker with her mouth frozen half open, Whitaker superimposed onto the deck of a sinking ship as Ibrahim sailed away triumphantly. A popular Instagram post showed Ibrahim photoshopped as a king on a golden throne, wearing dark sunglasses and framed by the words "The real judge has entered the room." Across platforms, the phrase "check your facts, your honor" became a rallying cry, slapped onto t-shirts, coffee mugs, and even phone cases, a cheeky badge of solidarity for those who'd ever felt dismissed or silenced by authority. Yet as the laughter rippled across screens, it was quickly joined by a darker, sharper current, a global debate that crackled with raw emotion and centuries of buried history. Commentators argued fiercely on roundtable shows, their voices overlapping as they dissected whether Whitaker's dismissive tone toward Ibrahim had been merely the bluster of a television personality or whether it revealed the persistent undercurrent of racial bias and colonial arrogance still pulsing through Western institutions. On one primetime panel, an impassioned legal scholar leaned forward, eyes flashing, and declared, "This wasn't just courtroom drama. This was a black African leader standing in the heart of an American media institution, demanding respect on equal terms." And for many people watching, that was nothing short of revolutionary. The conversation spread like spilled ink across continents. In Burkina Faso, radio stations buzzed with heated debates as callers expressed pride and astonishment that their president had not only held his own but turned the tables in such a powerful and public way. In Paris, students at the Sorbonne gathered in cafes, gesturing animatedly over espresso cups as they debated whether Whitaker's authority had ever been real or merely an illusion sustained by applause and celebrity. Across African diasporas in Europe and the United States, community centers held impromptu discussions where elders shared stories of judges, bosses, or officials who'd once silenced them, and younger generations spoke of how Ibrahim's courage made them feel seen and vindicated. Testimonies poured in, each carrying the weight of lived experience. A young lawyer in Atlanta posted a tearful video recounting how, as a black attorney, she'd been interrupted, questioned, and condescended to in courtrooms where she was supposed to belong, and how watching Ibrahim dismantle Whitaker's authority gave her hope that knowledge and dignity could still win. A civil rights activist in Johannesburg wrote an op-ed describing the moment as a global exorcism of colonial ghosts, praising Ibrahim for showing that even the sharpest tongue could be silenced by truth and constitutional principle. An older man in Ghana, his voice trembling with emotion in a radio interview, said, "We waited generations for someone to look power in the eye and say, 'You do not get to speak to us like that anymore.'" Amid the swirl of voices, even legal scholars weighed in, praising Ibrahim's precise citation of constitutional clauses and his refusal to be baited into disrespect or theatrics. Law professors began planning to include the courtroom clash in lectures about authority, race, and the separation between entertainment and real justice. Headlines roared that the moment marked not just a viral video but a turning point in how black leaders are perceived globally. And while the internet devoured every second of Whitaker's speechless face, a far deeper question pulsed beneath the viral spectacle. Was this the day when a single man from Burkina Faso finally proved that respect is earned by truth, not by titles, fame, or fear? And so, as the world watched with laughter and shock intertwined, one undeniable fact shimmered like a revelation. The courtroom that day was never merely a set for television. It had become a battlefield where centuries-old power dynamics were dragged into the light, and for the first time, the audience was forced to reckon with the possibility that authority, when challenged by truth, might not always have the last word. As the bright studio lights dimmed to a softer glow, an uneasy stillness settled over Judge Eleanor Whitaker's courtroom. A hush so deep that it seemed to vibrate in the wooden walls, echoing faintly like a memory of applause that had vanished into the past. For a few long moments, Whitaker remained perched on her elevated bench, her posture rigid but her face slack with exhaustion, as if the entire weight of her 25-year reign had suddenly pressed down upon her shoulders all at once. Her carefully coiffed silver hair was slightly mussed, strands escaping the lacquered perfection, and her lips, once so quick to curl into a scornful smile, were now drawn tight and pale, as though every ounce of moisture had drained from them. The set around her, a space meticulously designed to radiate authority with its towering wooden paneling, gleaming brass fixtures, and banners proclaiming justice with Whitaker, felt strangely hollow, like an abandoned stage after the final curtain has fallen. The silence was punctuated only by the soft, hesitant movements of her staff, who tiptoed around the courtroom like mourners at a funeral. Normally bustling with crisp, practiced efficiency, they now avoided each other's eyes as they gathered piles of paperwork into neat stacks and slid them into leather briefcases embossed with Whitaker's initials. One young assistant, a man with rumpled sleeves and anxious eyes, gently lifted the framed photograph that usually stood on Whitaker's bench, a photo capturing her in mid-gesture, mouth open as she delivered one of her trademark scoldings, the studio audience in the background roaring with laughter. He stared at the photo for a moment, the smile frozen on the judge's younger face, before slipping it carefully into bubble wrap, as if afraid it might shatter with even the slightest bump. The ceremonial gavel, polished to a dark gleam, lay untouched on the bench, its authority reduced to a silent prop. No one dared to pick it up. Outside, however, a different energy surged through the cool evening air, electric and unstoppable. The courthouse steps, usually quiet once taping ended, were now jammed with people pressed shoulder to shoulder behind a barricade of metal fencing, their breath forming pale clouds in the gathering dusk. Television news vans were parked haphazardly along the curb, cables snaking across the pavement like veins pulsing with the urgency of live broadcasts. Camera lights flared like miniature suns as reporters jostled for space, each eager to capture the next defining moment of a story that had erupted far beyond anyone's expectations. Chants rose and fell among the crowd, a patchwork chorus of different voices weaving together into a single thundering rhythm that echoed off the courthouse stone. Some people shouted Ibrahim's name, fists raised high, while others held up hastily scribbled signs reading truth over titles, justice without fear, and Ibrahim stood for us all. When Ibrahim Traoré finally emerged through the massive wooden doors, he paused for just an instant under the bright lights that turned his dark suit into a subtle shimmer of charcoal and silver. His shoulders were square, his head held high, though his eyes flicked wearily over the sea of cameras and faces. For the briefest moment, an almost imperceptible crease formed between his brows, as if he felt the full weight of history pressing down on him. Then the crowd erupted into cheers so loud it rattled the metal barricades, a rolling roar of applause and shouts that seemed to sweep away the last shadows lingering from the courtroom. Phones shot into the air, their screens glowing as they captured every angle, each eager to record the man who had dared to silence America's most feared judge. People surged forward, straining against security's outstretched arms, some reaching for Ibrahim's hand, others simply wanting to touch the sleeve of his suit, as though some of his resolve might rub off on them. A young woman near the front sobbed openly, wiping tears from her cheeks as she cried out, "Thank you for showing them we are not invisible." An older man held up a sign in French that read "Respect se mérite." Respect is earned, his voice breaking as he tried to explain to a nearby reporter how he'd waited decades to see someone look power in the eye and refuse to bow. A group of young African-American students wearing matching t-shirts emblazoned with Ibrahim's face chanted, "This is what truth looks like," over and over until their voices grew hoarse. Nearby, a young reporter, clutching a trembling microphone, spoke breathlessly into her camera, her eyes wide with the excitement of witnessing history unfold. "This isn't just a courtroom story anymore," she told her unseen audience. This is a global conversation about race, authority, and the right to question those who claim power. President Traoré didn't just challenge a judge. He challenged an entire system. And tonight, millions of people are asking the same question: what price will he pay for speaking this truth? As Ibrahim continued down the steps, moving slowly through the throng, he paused again, looking out over the crowd with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and quiet apprehension. The cheers washed over him like a tide, but in his eyes was the distant, pensive stare of a man already calculating the consequences yet to come. For in the spaces between the chanting voices and waving signs, there lurked a hush, a shared awareness that while this day might be celebrated as a triumph, the battle was far from over. Powerful people who had seen their authority questioned on the world stage would not forget, nor would they forgive easily. And as the camera lens zoomed in, framing Ibrahim's silhouette against the twilight sky, the scene froze for a single perfect moment. His dark figure stood half in shadow, half illuminated by the harsh white glare of media lights. The courthouse loomed behind him like a fortress, both conquered and still dangerous. The voiceover slipped in like a whisper, echoing in the stillness, low and filled with both wonder and dread. He had risked everything to say what no one else would. Was this the moment a man stood up for real justice, or the day he challenged power so boldly it could cost him everything? And as the final frame held on his face, a hush fell over the crowd once more, a silence deep enough that it seemed the entire world was leaning in, waiting to discover whether truth, this time, would be enough to prevail. In the days and weeks that followed, the ripples from Ibrahim Traoré's quiet yet thunderous stand continued to spread outward, touching corners of the world far beyond the courtroom where the clash had begun. Headlines around the globe carried variations of the same astonished message: President silences America's toughest judge, a new voice for global justice, and one man, one truth, a world listening. Across continents, prime ministers, presidents, and human rights advocates stepped forward, their statements pouring in like an unexpected tide. A European Union spokesperson commended Ibrahim's extraordinary poise under fire, describing his performance as a lesson in the power of constitutional principles over personalities. In Africa, leaders from neighboring nations praised his courage, not merely as a political maneuver but as an act of profound moral clarity. A prominent West African statesman proclaimed on live television, Ibrahim did not merely defend himself. He defended the dignity of every leader from a continent too often dismissed or ridiculed on the global stage. Meanwhile, in America, talk shows and opinion columns buzzed with debate, dissecting how a courtroom known for slapstick justice had transformed overnight into a crucible of genuine reckoning. Legal scholars marveled at Ibrahim's calm constitutional citations, while civil rights leaders hailed the moment as a spark for conversations that had long been overdue. Even within Whitaker's own sphere, quiet admissions began to slip through the cracks of her once impenetrable facade. At first, she maintained a tight-lipped silence, avoiding interviews and declining to appear on her usual circuit of talk shows. But eventually, in a subdued segment taped in her chambers, Judge Eleanor Whitaker stared directly into the camera, her eyes somber under the studio lights. She spoke with a gravity her fans had rarely seen, saying, "I have built my reputation on knowing the law and commanding respect. But sometimes, respect is also knowing when to listen." President Traoré knew his facts, and he spoke them with conviction. For that, he deserves acknowledgement. Though her words were measured, the entire nation recognized the significance of that quiet concession. A woman who had once been untouchable admitting, for the first time, that she had been outmatched by knowledge and truth. Yet even as the world showered Ibrahim with praise, the man himself remained strikingly reserved, declining countless interviews and instead focusing on his duties back home in Burkina Faso. Footage circulated of him returning to Ouagadougou, stepping off the plane into a sea of waving flags and jubilant crowds. But beyond a brief statement thanking his supporters, he offered little fanfare. In private moments, captured by cameras at a respectful distance, he was seen greeting children in dusty village streets, listening to farmers discuss drought conditions, and attending strategy meetings about regional security, as though the courtroom showdown that had riveted the planet were merely a single chapter in a much larger mission. To his advisors, he confessed quietly that he had never sought to become a symbol, that his only goal had been to stand for truth wherever it was threatened. As these scenes played across screens around the world, the voiceover emerged gentle yet strong, carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. It spoke as images faded between Ibrahim standing alone in a courtroom, Judge Whitaker looking reflective beneath softer lights, and crowds of ordinary people watching, thinking, and daring to hope. Respect is not granted by titles, nor by robes, nor by the roar of a studio audience, the voiceover said, each word echoing as if spoken in the chambers of history itself. Respect is earned in the crucible of truth. It's forged by knowledge, by courage, and by the willingness to speak when silence would be easier. The music rose, a subtle swell of strings that trembled with quiet triumph. And the camera lingered on a single final shot of Ibrahim, his silhouette framed by the golden African sun, eyes focused on some distant point beyond the horizon. Sometimes, the voiceover concluded, voice almost a whisper yet ringing with certainty, the loudest voice is not the one shouting, but the one armed with truth. And as the screen faded to black, the audience was left with a feeling that transcended mere entertainment, the conviction that one person, standing unflinching in the face of power, could change the world. The characters and events depicted in this story, including Ibrahim Traoré, are entirely fictional and do not represent real people, living or deceased, or actual events. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.